Oh, hello and welcome to part 2 of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. We're talking about his ideas today. This is in fact me from the future because I decided to separate this into 2 different segments. Part 1 where we talk about his life and part 2 where we talk about his ideas. And that's just because I realized after I'd read through the whole script and recorded everything that it was extremely long. So we're breaking it up into 2 pieces just to preserve my sanity and to make sure that these are still kind of bite-sized things that you can listen to while folding laundry, all that good stuff. So thank you so much for coming back to part 2. Please don't forget to check out the Champagne Anarchism Patreon channel, patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. The rest of this 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers is up there. So please do check that out if you have time. And thank you once more for returning. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. Let's talk a little bit about some of those ideas and let's talk about what they've meant for the development of anarchism as a whole, as a political doctrine. And we will start with his ideas on order. The thing about order, when we talk about Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and his work, is that he did not believe that order had to be imposed from above. In fact, it was actually the complete opposite way around. And in this way, Proudhon's maxim that anarchy is order is instructive because Proudhon in fact believes that the state is the enemy of order because it imposes what is not order but a state of servitude. The state for Proudhon is about limiting the capacity of humans, limiting what humans can do and are capable of in order to turn them into instruments. Do we call that order? I mean, we can think about that a little bit. It may be called a type of order, and it may be quite an efficient order, but it's not the order of humanity, it's the order of a well-oiled machine. And it's not a desirable thing for us or anyone if you desire anything beyond just the efficiency of a system. Proudhon wrote, "To be governed is to be watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, legislated, regimented, closed in, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, assessed, evaluated, censored, commanded, all by creatures that have neither the right nor wisdom nor virtue." And there you see the venom, right? This hatred of the state, by the way, extends well beyond empire, monarchy. It extends to democracy as well. And remember, this is kind of a bold position for Proudhon because democracy at the time was a fairly fragile thing in Proudhon's time of empire and collapse followed by empire again. But rather than stepping in to defend the fragile constitutional democracy like many of his contemporaries were quite happy to do, Proudhon went all out against it, declaring that democracy is nothing but a constitutional tyrant. And Proudhon in this way is flipping the way we think about democracy on its head. You might be thinking, for example, that democracy is rule by the people. That is reinforced, the power of the people is reinforced through periodic elections, where we make sure that the powerful that we have anointed remain accountable to the people. Proudhon said, no, you're thinking about this the wrong way. Between those elections, when you have people actually taking power and having a say in their government, that's when the people do have something of a say. But between those elections, it is just the people giving up their power to a powerful class. And so once every few years, when an election cycle rolls around, you have a type of power, but it's a farcical type of power. And crucially, it's a type of power that you abandon immediately. And then we come back to order, right? Because once you abandon power, then the powerful, the elite interests are going to reimpose order over society to protect their own interests. And in every case, they're not looking out for your interests, Proudhon tells us. They're looking out for their interests. It was in fact a version of the idea of order from above that pushes Proudhon to campaign against communism. Communism for Proudhon is an authoritarian version of imposed order. And that might be a little tough to swallow because communism does claim to represent the will of the people. Communism originates from the people. Communism, in many varieties of communism, is meant to be an upsurge of popular proletarian power that then imposes order from above, because you do need to instill some kind of structure to manage the communist state. However, Proudhon looks at that structure and says, no, 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 you are imposing order from above again. This is dictatorial and it is authoritarian. So communism's claims to represent the people, especially the worker, for Proudhon, he's not buying it. He saw any kind of authoritarian attempt at liberation to be a false promise. Order cannot be imposed from above, and a revolution cannot be run from above. A revolution has to be spontaneously from below. And it bears mentioning here that Proudhon, of course, you can point to any number of revolutions that have been sort of driven from above, but Proudhon does not believe that those are legitimate revolutions in any meaningful sense. He needs a revolution, a true and organic revolution, to occur from below. Now, for us, knowing the history, knowing what comes after this, and I'm recording this video in the year 2025, for us kind of sitting here now, this may be a little bit of a tough idea to swallow, because we can think of the most successful revolutions in modern history, and they have almost all been driven from above. They had plans, they were guided, they saw very powerful, very charismatic leaders take charge. People like Vladimir Lenin, people like Ho Chi Minh, people like Fidel Castro, whatever it is, you have these strong, charismatic leaders who are centralizing power around themselves and leading the revolution. And Proudhon might tell us that these are not authentic revolutions. He wrote, "Revolutions have no instigators. They come when fate beckons." Now, a lot of ink has been spilled about what a true revolution is, what a true revolution looks like. Just know that Proudhon believes in this kind of true organic revolution from below, but he does soften his approach later on in life. He kind of admits that a few individuals may have more to do with instilling revolutionary fervor than he had previously admitted, so there is something to this idea of the individual in a revolution. This is a constant battle, by the way, between theorists at this time, between individualists and kind of Hegelian people who are rejecting this sense of the individual as being the primary driver of all of this. Just for now, recognize that Proudhon is giving a little more credence to the idea, perhaps, that some individuals could help to drive this revolutionary fervor. But really, Proudhon has in his head the idea of what a true revolution looks like, and it looks a lot like the revolution that he had seen himself in France of the 1800s. And that was something that was, at least to his understanding, very spontaneous, very from below. He saw masses of people organizing just out of nowhere, and that is what he believed to be a true revolution. So this, when we talk about his life really influencing his work, this is him looking around himself at this period in revolutionary France and saying, this is how true revolution happens. So where does all of this leave us with Proudhon and his ideas of order? Well, Proudhon is advancing at the time an idea of natural order. He believed that humans were perfectly capable of dealing with each other and organizing their affairs without some kind of top-down control from the authoritarian state apparatus. What the state offered then was a kind of artificial order. And that artificial order was directly oppositional to his idea of a natural order. The state's imposed servitude interferes with our ideas and our ability to manage ourselves. And that is very, very resonant in modern anarchism. But with that, let's close this bit on order and turn to property. We should talk about Proudhon's ideas when it comes to property, because these are nuanced. So, property. This is a bit of a tricky one. Of course, Proudhon gives us this very famous maxim that property is theft, but he does not mean that in the way that you might expect him to mean that. And that's because for Proudhon, regular property is absolutely fine. He has no problem with sort of individuals owning their own land and owning their own tools on kind of a small scale. Nowadays, if you look around anarchist circles, that can be a little bit unheard of. We have kind of baked into the modern anarchist idea, an idea of at least collective ownership over things. And it depends how you sort of apportion that. We talked about Murray Bookchin before and his idea of usufruct, which is the thing belongs to the person who needs it, and then it is given up. It is a constant process of negotiation through different people. However, for Proudhon, he has no real problem with private property. What he does have a problem with is excessive private property. Now, why is it that Proudhon doesn't have a problem with private property? It's because he sees private property as a means towards freedom. So he's looking around at the people around him in France at the time and saying, if you don't have private property, if you don't own your own property, you are at the mercy of whoever does own that property. And so in Proudhon's mind, the idea of ownership of a little plot of land, etc., protects you from the giant landowner. So his conception of individual private property is more about freedom. What Proudhon did have a problem with was property that was owned in excess. So there is a modest minimum amount in Proudhon's mind, and when you exceed that, that's when property becomes theft. That's when property becomes rent-seeking or interest-bearing. He's talking about multiple houses. He's talking about massive amounts of land. He's talking about giant factories. You can extract capital from workers. If you own so much of one thing that you can begin to extract profits off of it based on just the fact that you own that thing, that in Proudhon's mind is excess. So what Proudhon is really targeting here then is unearned income, rents, and profits. And when you have that sort of ownership, that needs to be scaled down or collectively owned through something like a workers' collective or workers' association, something like that. This is the idea that Proudhon has in mind. But individual private property, Proudhon's not against it. That may seem fairly tame if you put it up against a modern anarchist thinker, or in fact, some of the proto-anarchist thinkers that we talked about before. But remember that rents and unearned capital are kind of the load-bearing pillar of the capitalist economy. Without it, capitalism isn't going to hold. What Proudhon is attacking here is the foundation of capitalism, is the fundamental, most basic thing about the capitalist economy. And that is, in its own way, deeply revolutionary. Now, he doesn't go as far as some of the modern thinkers, but it is still a profoundly revolutionary idea that he's advanced. But let's move on from property. And let's talk about the specific political program that he was arguing for. Let's talk about mutualism. Mutualism is a really interesting term. It pops up modern day as well. Proudhon called himself an anarchist, but the word that he used for the society that he was trying to build wasn't anarchism, it was mutualism. To properly understand mutualism, you have to understand that what Proudhon was trying to do was he was trying to build a third path through what he saw as kind of capitalism and capitalist mode of production and the rising communism of the time. So Proudhon is looking at these two alternatives and saying, can we not do something different, something that avoids both of these because they are both, to him, based on some type of authoritarian structure. One, capitalism is an economic structure, and the other is elite power brokers. And his alternative was, let's do neither of these. Instead, replace that top-down structure with a bottom-up management. So basically, a society that is based on reciprocity and voluntary association. And voluntary association or voluntary cooperation is a very, very present idea in modern anarchism. And mutualism in practice looks like the frequent use of workers' associations as well as free credit. We see an echo of the People's Bank that he tried to set up. And this bank, he believed, could lend money out without charging interest. And if people simply joined together and essentially pooled their resources, you could remove a key form of exploitation from modern capitalism, which is interest. And especially excessively high interests, often known as usury. And in this, you see a bit of a distinction because Proudhon doesn't want to eliminate markets. He doesn't really mind markets as such, but what he does want to eliminate is those concentrations of excessive ownership, excessive capital, but also excessive wealth, excessive property, whatever it was in excess that permeated the economy and gave people, key market participants, significantly more power than others. He essentially wanted everybody in the market to start from the same starting point, eliminating things like interest, rent, and excessive profits from the equation. Now, to my mind, Proudhon's contributions on the market, his ideas specifically in this area, are one of his weaker contributions. Now, there are people who take this seriously. However, I think that if you look at it fairly, they are not well thought out, they're quite confusing, and they are often very contradictory. Now, there are absolutely some people, some anarchists, who try to build out market systems in their anarchist economies, even some that integrate currencies and money into the functioning of their anarchist societies. There are interesting ways to do that, and it could potentially work, but Proudhon's version here is not that. Proudhon's version feels like a halfway point and kind of half-baked point between the modern world and the modern economy and something like David Graeber's gift economy. And that's something where people continue to produce things, but it's because they do that out of the love and care and concern for those around them and the need to contribute something to society and also just the desire to create beautiful things. But that's not what Proudhon is putting forward here. Proudhon's version is significantly muddier, and it's telling that his People's Bank does end up collapsing despite incredibly high enrollment. It's just very, very tough to practically build those ideas into a working economy without setting up something that is going to go in and target and eliminate concentrations of power and wealth and hierarchy and all of this stuff. It is very, very difficult to build this into a practical application. But Proudhon is unwilling to sacrifice the market mechanism here. Anyway, that's just something that I keep coming back to if I go in and read Proudhon. Either way, to run his society under mutualism, Proudhon does not want the state. Instead, what he wants is kind of a sprawling and interlocking set of voluntary associations to manage things their own way. Workers' associations, like we mentioned, but also some variety of communes, and then some variety of federations of communes. Communes that occasionally come together and deal with things as a collection of communes. And the idea here is that anything that could be handled by these independent and collective associations of people should be handled by them and not by the state. And broadly, that is mutualism. Now, today, the actual definition of mutualism is a little tough to pin down. Actually, a lot of times it's interchangeable with anarchism in general. Sometimes it is a specific reference to what Proudhon was developing here. The definition has changed. If you encounter, therefore, a reference to mutualism, you kind of have to understand where the thinker is coming from. It's tough to say mutualism and mean just one thing. You need to know a little bit more about the context here. But that is all to say that mutualism is still very much with us, just in many different forms. And now we will leave Proudhon's principal idea for how to organize society here, and we're going to turn to labor. And labor is very interesting here because labor, when we talk about labor in the context of Proudhon, what we're really talking about is the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is the idea that you can derive the value of a good from the amount of labor it takes to produce that good. At first blush, that actually may sound pretty good. The labor theory of value, or LTV as it's sometimes called, is a little bit of a tricky concept though. Let's dig into it just a little bit. The LTV comes to us from Adam Smith, although there are other versions of it that precede him, but he's the one that really kind of concretizes it. And then it's developed further through the work of people like David Ricardo. And then Karl Marx picks it up and also runs with it. And of course, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon also depends on the labor theory of value. There is an intense and very long-running debate about what exactly value is and how to calculate it. Do we value things, for example, based on the labor it took to produce them? Do you buy into this idea of the labor theory of value? If you do, one of the classic arguments against it is, well, I could just go and I could dig a hole and I could fill it back in. I could do that for an hour. Is that a valuable thing to do? Does the thing that I have done have 1 hour of labor time worth of value in that case? Probably not. We probably wouldn't really value that terribly much. What about if you value things based on how useful they are? Well, okay, useful to whom? Do we value things based on their usefulness for one person versus another person to society at large? Who defines that? How do you value things like weapons of war relative to bread to feed people? How do we actually put a value based on their usefulness? But then there's another one, which is, okay, what about taking it to market? How about its exchange value? What if you take it to a free and open market and say, okay, how much will you pay me for this good? Fine, that also sounds good, but then that can also tend to undervalue the amount of work that people have done to do that. It actually will try to extract profit off of their labor. And there's much more to that calculation of value as well, because how do you then account for things like advertising, which may boost what people are willing to pay on an open market? Or how about this? How about enforced scarcity? How about a luxury brand destroying old versions of their product to boost the value of something else that they're just about to produce? That happens a lot. There are any number of things that can manipulate consumers and buyers into overvaluing a product that may obscure the product's, what we might call, its true value. Would it be more effective to just talk about the exchange value? This thing, how many potatoes could it be worth on the market if we were to merely exchange these goods? That is a nearly impossible thing to calculate. So all of this is just to say that there's a lot of philosophical debate around the value of a thing and how to find it. I'm not going to take a position on any of this, but Proudhon is. He's going to wade straight into this argument and say, actually, you can build your economic system and base it all off a sophisticated calculation of labor value, the value of labor that has gone into producing this product. And the objection, you might be going immediately, yeah, okay, cool. That's really tough to do in real life. And it is. One person's labor hour is not going to be equivalent to another person's labor hour. And that's for a multitude of reasons. There's innate ability that some person may have. There is physical capacity that another person may have. There is education received by one person. There is also the fact that some person may be disabled and less immediately able to do something, even though they will work twice as hard to do it. And so if somebody is disabled and has to work twice the amount of time to do the same thing, do we cut the value of their labor time in half? Surely not, if we're trying to develop a society that's roughly equitable. And also if we're not monsters. But this is Proudhon trying to engage with one of the kind of obsessions with these early anarchist thinkers. You will run into this multiple times as we go through this series. So people like Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin want to practically assign some kind of value to labor inputs. And it really makes sense that they want to do that. We talked about Proudhon's value on work ethic, for example. But neither of these thinkers wants any freeloaders in the anarchist societies that they're trying to build. They really want to incentivize work somehow without collapsing into capitalism. There are many later rounds of anarchist thinkers who will start to kind of wave this away and say things like, well, people care about other people and will be willing to work to make sure that they are okay. And also that people just kind of naturally will want to do as much as they possibly can because they believe in the mission of the community, and so they will work. You don't have to calculate or incentivize really anything because people are there and they come from a good place and will want to do the hard work that is necessary to keep the community afloat. There are also thinkers like Murray Bookchin who say, well, actually, we may come to a position in time where we start to think about work and life as being basically the same thing. You don't segment life and work into different things. That's kind of a relic of capitalist thinking. Really, we work and we live, and they're kind of one and the same. So you will encounter later anarchist thinkers that think this way, but at this point in time, the Proudhons, the Bakunins of the world, they are looking at this, and they are also trying to distance themselves from Karl Marx, who says, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. They do not want to follow that formulation. That's Karl Marx's thing. They want their own kind of thing to try to calculate something and make sure that work is incentivized in the new hard-won communes that they're trying to build. So that's where Proudhon is coming from when he tries to do this kind of sophisticated calculation around labor and how to value it. So that brings us to the end of these kind of main lines of thinking with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon as he's trying to develop his early ideas of anarchism and his early ideas of mutualism. And all of that we should talk about in the context of his legacy. Let's talk about the legacy of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, because a lot of the anarchists that come after Proudhon are very much working in his shadow. Proudhon, of course, has a very prominent position in the history of anarchism. He's the first self-declared anarchist. As far as we know, his work very much kind of lit the flame that would turn into modern anarchism. But maybe the contribution that is perhaps still the most influential is this early feud that he starts with Karl Marx. So this is a split that Proudhon really lays the groundwork for, and we've talked about this a little bit, but it all comes back to this idea of authoritarianism. Now, it's a little unfair to talk about Karl Marx's ideas as authoritarian. A lot of the things that later become known to us as communism would not have necessarily been recognizable for Karl Marx. And you have to look no further than modern-day China and the Communist Party of China to see that this is kind of a bastardization of Marx's ideas and the ways that he was envisioning a genuine bottom-up revolution of the proletariat. However, Proudhon's early refusal to align himself with Marx and the Marxian way of thinking kind of sets the stage for this rupture that's going to absolutely dash the dreams of the First International and this rising leftist movement. There's a split between the followers of Marx and the followers of Bakunin. We will talk much more about that again when we get to Bakunin, but for now, just know that this stage was very much laid or set out by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And that is a split that still exists now. The split, as I say, is all about authority. Can you centralize a structure that will run a communist system or a socialist system, or must that be decentralized? If you create a communist revolution that is very top-driven, does that risk turning into what it was initially created to foment a revolution against? Does it become just kind of another form of oppression? That's what Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is arguing. And that is something that I think modern day we have to take very, very seriously. And so it's a natural split, but it starts with him. But of course, there are a ton of Proudhon ideas that we still live with in modern anarchism that are still kind of key for his legacy. We've talked about many of them. And even if we've advanced our ideas of property as theft and embraced more a kind of a communal property idea, and again, it depends on the anarchist you talk to, but we've also kind of abandoned the labor theory of value and trying to put a specific value on that, all of this stuff. Proudhon's early ideas about things like eliminating interests, eliminating rents, eliminating these concentrations of capital that kind of keep us all enslaved to a broader capitalist system are still profoundly influential. And even if you don't go as far as anarchism, you can still build them into a reformist movement that takes on the underpinnings of the global inequality that we see before us today. Also, Proudhon's ideas of voluntary association and voluntary cooperation are very, very much present in the modern anarchist system, and his ideas of federation are still very, very much with us. And then the last thing that I will say about Proudhon's legacy is that, as you will see, if you pick up any of Proudhon's multiple writings and start reading through it, the passion, the verve, the just power that he writes with is kind of infectious and still, I think, relevant to a modern anarchist struggle. So I think it's incredibly important to study somebody like Proudhon, even if many of his ideas were contradictory, even if a lot of it could be seen as more style than substance. It's extremely important to understand where Proudhon was coming from and how he lays the foundations for the thinkers that come after him. So thank you very much for watching through this video on Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, his life, his thought, and all of that. Please like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Do check out that Patreon channel if you get a chance, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I'll be back in 2 weeks to talk talk about our next thinker, and that is, of course, Mikhail Bakunin. We're going to get into his kind of badass and deeply revolutionary life, and of course the thought and his schism, his split with Marx, and all of this stuff we'll be talking about 2 weeks from now. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.